It's October, 1065. King Edward the Confessor is out hunting with two of his most powerful barons, Harold, Earl of Wessex, and Tostig, Earl of Northumbria. Suddenly, a messenger bursts out of the woods, panting a desperate message. "Sir," he shouts, "the Thanes of Northumbria are in rebellion. They've captured York and declared Tostig deposed." "What?" roars Edward, furious. "How could they? They've called Tostig a tyrant, and have elected Morcar, Earl Edwin's brother, as the new earl." "Well, we must destroy them," calls Edward. Turning, he looks to Harold at his side. "Gather your men. We march to war." Harold stands still. Edward stares. "What are you waiting for?" he calls. Edward waits again to respond. "Sir," he begins, "it's the Thanes' right to remove any leader they deem tyrannical." Edward glares. Tostig growls. "The Thanes have really seized York, and with the Earl of Mercia's troops ready to defend his brother, then marching north will only plunge the kingdom into civil war." "You disobey an order from your king?" shouts an angry Edward. "You're the king. You can raise your own army," replies Harold with a smirk. Both men know the truth. Within the kingdom of England, it's Harold Godwinson who holds the real power. Hey guys, this is King Julian here, back with another video. This time, we're going a bit further in the past to cover the Norman Conquest of England. To understand how the situation in the woods came about, one must go all the way back to 1042, when Arthacanute, the King of England and Denmark, died. England had been under a constant state of war, alternating between Viking and Anglo-Saxon rulers, culminating in the North Sea Empire of Norway, Denmark, and England under Arthacanute's father, Knut the Great. Norway is seized by his brother Magnus, King of Norway. However, another brother named Edward manages to take the crown of England. Edward, though, is not his brother through his father, but through his mother, and Edward's father was the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. You see, Knut had pulled the ultimate Chad power move by killing his foe, conquering his kingdom, and then taking his wife. Edward had spent most of his life in exile in Normandy, but when he finally returned to England, he found it divided between three magnates: Leofric, Earl of Mercia; Siward, the Danish Earl of Northumbria; and by far the most powerful, Godwin, Earl of Wessex. Edward immediately set out to ally with Godwin. He made Godwin's eldest son, Sweyn, the Earl of Hereford, his second son, Harold, the Earl of East Anglia, and married Edith, Godwin's daughter. Now, Sweyn did the not-so bright thing of trying to abduct an abbess and marry her for the churchland. But because, lots of people in medieval England were really devout. I mean, after all, Edward would become known as Edward the Confessor, and he was exiled by a furious Harold. Sweyn eventually returned to find that his land had been taken by a noble named Bjorn. He murdered Bjorn, and then fled again. This time, Edward decided to make his nephew Ralph the Earl. Godwin, not liking this, exerted his influence to force Harold to unexile Sweyn and reinstate him as Earl. Now, as you can probably tell, this pissed off Edward, and so when the Archbishop of Canterbury died, and one of Godwin's relatives was elected, Edward said no, and appointed a Norman named Robert in his place. This set a precedent of Normans taking powerful positions in England, especially in the clergy. Edward then ordered Godwin to burn a village. He happened to own this village. Godwin was like, "No, what the heck, dude?" And so the kingdom, quite unfortunately, caught a bad case of civil war. Leofric and Siward, however, backed Edward. and so Godwin and his sons were forced to flee to Flanders and Ireland. Edward's wife Edith was repudiated at Robert's urging. Siwin died soon after whilst on a pilgrimage, leaving Harold as Godwin's eldest son and heir. Ralph received Hereford back, and East Anglia was given to Leofric. Also, Edward made a vague promise to the Duke of Normandy, named William, that he could inherit the throne if Edward died childless in exchange for William's support. I'm sure this will not come up later. Godwin and Harold eventually returned to England with an army. This time, however, Siward and Leofric refused to march in favor of Edward, fearing a civil war that would leave the kingdom vulnerable to Viking raiders. And William kind of forgot about his promise, so humiliated Edward was forced to return Godwin and Harold to their titles and bring back Edith. However, he was able to force Harold to give up some hostages. Robert, fearing Godwin's vengeance, fled England. He was replaced as Archbishop by Stigand, an ally of Godwin. The House of Godwin had been weakened down to only Godwin's original lands in Wessex and Kent. It was an Astari estate. But then all the boys started dying, starting with Godwin, making Harold the new earl. Siward was next, and in 1055 he was succeeded by his son Waltheof. Oh wait, no, he was still a child, and Harold got his brother Tostig elected as the new earl. Finally, the third Earl, Leofric, died, but his son Aelfgar was outlawed for treason at Godwin's urging. He married his daughter to the King of Wales, Gruffydd, and the two invaded. The two invaded with an army and defeated Earl Ralph, but Harold collected an army to fight them back. They made an agreement that Aelfgar would succeed in Mercia. Waltheof took Northampton, and Harold's brother Gith took East Anglia. Ralph continued this long and storied tradition of dying, allowing Harold to acquire Hereford, and making his brother Leofwine the Earl of Kent, including extensive lands in Essex. By now nearly all of England, save Mercia, and Edward's personal lands were under Harold's control. I think you can guess what happened to Aelfgar, who was succeeded by the Earl of Mercia by his son Edwin. Okay, now all the characters are getting on stage. Harold had, in just over a decade, drastically reversed his family's fortunes, from a declining house out of favor with the king to being essentially the only house in the entire kingdom that had any power. Leofric's descendants had lost Northampton and East Anglia, and Siward's son had been relegated from mighty Northumbria to a piece of Mercia. Not only that, but if you'll notice, no landowners from the original map are left alive. Edward is the last of a generation, and is growing old and lost his attention to politics. In all aspects of government, Harold is now the de facto ruler of England. Finally, we get to this hypothetical hunting incident. By 1065, the Thanes, or Knights of Northumbria, had had enough and overthrew Tostig. The people of the northern lands were a mix of Viking settlers and the few Anglo-Saxons tough enough to survive repeated Danish, Norse, and Scottish incursions. Tostig was a southern lord and a bit of a tyrant. The Thanes stormed York, slaughtered many of Tostig's supporters, and replaced him with Morcar, Earl Edwin's brother. Morcar and Edwin, aware of the coup in advance, gathered an army and together marched down to Northampton, ready to confront Edward. Harold went up and parleyed with the two earls. And, realizing, quite aptly, that Tostig had doomed himself, and well aware that the northern earls planned to rebel and possibly form a new northern kingdom, decided to prevent a civil war to give in to their demands. Edward, like Tostig, and the two protested quite loudly, but his words fell on, predictably, deaf ears. Without Harold, he was powerless. This meant that England was now split between two powerful families, with Wessex, Kent, and East Anglia under Harold and his two loyal siblings' control, and Mercia, Northumbria, and York under Edwin and Morcar. And as Edward had no heirs, it looked as though a civil war would erupt upon his death. Finally, Edward did die. He didn't have any children, so his supposed heir was his great-grandnephew, Edgar Atheling. But Edgar had absolutely no backing. The northern earls looking for independence, and the southern earls were all Harold and his bros. Edward had also favored Harold as successor and entrusted him the kingdom upon his death. A Wittengamot, or meeting of the lords, was called. And in exchange for the northern earls' support, Harold agreed to divorce his wife and marry Edwin and Morcar's sister, named, can you guess it, Edith, who happened to be the widow of that pesky Welsh king who had invaded a few years ago, killed by Harold. It seems that the only name that Anglo-Saxons could come up with at this point was Edith. After all, it had been a name of his old wife. Harold was now the king. He was crowned in Canterbury by Ealdred, Archbishop of York. All the powerful lords were now his allies. He had secured the backing of the clergy, the people, and the knights. He had the blessing of the dead king. What could go wrong? Things immediately started going wrong. First of all, the oh-so-troublesome, trust me, we aren't even getting started, people of York started complaining, so you had to march up north to pacify them. Then, our boy William from earlier came knocking on the door. Looks like he's come up again. Ah, shoot. William was a bastard, and the thing about bastards, they cause minor, succession crises. He had been dodging assassination attempts and coups by his greedy uncles his entire life. He had also been doing a lot of fighting with his neighbors, like during the Flemish succession conflict, and seizing Maine from the Count of Anjou. He was a world-class expert on succession disputes and warfare by this point. He has that claim that Edward gave him a while ago, and Harold hasn't been making it easy on himself. Edward actually gave William the hostages from earlier at some point, and Willie used them to force Harold to swear to never to claim the throne. And in another situation, he was shipwrecked near Ponto, and was forced to do the same thing a second time in return for his release. So William feels like he should be the king. And then there's Tostig, who's pissed at Harold because he wants his earldom back. Tostig sailed to Flanders and received a fleet from his brother-in-law, the Count there, and then sailed to the Isle of Wight to begin raiding England. He sacked some lands in Kent, but was unable to complete anything and fled back into the sea. He sailed to East Anglia and tried to convince his brother, Gurth the Earl, to join them. When Gurth predictably refused, after all, it was Harold who had made him the Earl, Tostig marched north and began raiding Lincoln. Edwin and Morcar formed an army and forced Tostig to flee yet again, all the way up to Scotland, where his sworn brother, and he had to chill out, his raiding force essentially abandoning him. And then you have another Harold, Harold Haraldra, king of Norway, with a claim from the days of the North Sea Empire. He's old but rearing for a fight, and Tostig sails to Norway and manages to convince him to claim the throne. So now you have a three-way war for the Kingdom of England. William asks Harold politely for the throne, and Harold claims the oaths he made were under duress, and was elected by the people anyway. Nothing you can do about it. Harold believed that William was the more credible threat, and William was much closer to England and began raising his levies near England. Harold's army was made of infantry from three main groups. The elite, well-trained huscarls, part of him and his earl's personal bodyguards, were by far the most veteran troops. There were also the thanes, minor nobles and knights, and each brought a squadron of third levies with them. Because of the skirmish and raiding nature of Anglo-Saxon warfare and the rolling hills of England, archers were rare and cavalry even rarer. Rather, battle tactics were determined by a shield wall of elite infantry holding the line and successfully and decisively crushing the charging enemy. However, it was mostly made up of soldiers from the south, as Edward and Morcar decided to keep their own forces separate from Harold. Thus, the only two major nobles who accompanied Harold in the battle were his brothers, Gurth, Earl of East Anglia, and Leofwine, Earl of Kent. He had an estimated 2,500 men. William raised as many Norman levies as possible, and promising wealth and glory, received many volunteers from neighboring provinces such as Flanders or Brittany, all looking to form up at Dives. These men included second sons, minor cousins, or knight-errants wanting to prove themselves. Notable men who accompanied him included those such as his half-brothers, Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, Robert, Count of Mortain, the Flemish Eustace, Count of Boulogne, the Breton Alan Rufus, and his brothers Brian and another Alan, all sons of the Count of Penthievre, and Normans such as Robert de Beaumont, the Count of Milan, William the Count of Evreux, Geoffrey Count of Mortain, and Amory Viscount Tours, among various other minor barons. Estimates for his army size vary from around 7,000 to 10,000. Unlike Harold, though, William had cavalry and archers, a lot of them. In the fields and rivers of northern France, there were many more opportunities for the knight to make his devastating cavalry charge, and arrow technology was much further advanced on the continent. Harold's army was mainly made up of roving Viking warriors. They were skilled, much more so than the fords and levies they would be facing, but far less organized and unaccustomed to subjugations, sieges, and set-piece battles. He gathered a number close to 10,000 men. The winds were blowing south, which meant that Harold and William were just sitting staring at each other across the channel. William tried to sail over at one point, but shipwrecked on some rocks and returned, this time to St. Valery. However, the wind was in fact perfect for Haradra, sailing from Norway and regrouping in Tostig and the Orkney Islands. And from there, the two men sailed to Yorkshire. They shocked everybody with their speed, and managed to start, the classic Viking tradition of burning stuff down. They started with Scarborough, and continued up to the mouth of the Humber River, raiding and burning along the way. They went up the Ouse, with Edwin and Morcar desperately trying to raise enough men to protect York. On the 20th, in a bid to hold the crucial city, Edwin and Morcar prematurely engaged the Norwegian force. It nearly worked. Many of Harold and Tostig's men were still disembarking, and although Harold had nearly twice as many men as the two earls, the lords actually had more men at the beginning of the battle. There was a flooded back in between the forces, unfortunately, and Edward and Morcar were unable to attack, allowing Harold to pull more men in to reinforce. Morcar had 3,000 and Edward only 1,800 for the fight. They arrayed themselves so that the River Orne protected their right flank, with the left held back by marshes. These marshes also stretched behind their army, meaning there was no way to organize a fighting retreat. If they fled, the battle was over, and their army would be scattered. Harold positioned his least experienced troops under Tostig on his right flank, but put his veterans on the left. Opposite Tostig was Morcar's Northumbrians, the stronger of the two Saxon forces. Around noon, the tide receded, and Morcar decided to attack, as they still outnumbered Haradra. Tostig's forces had been positioned near the beck for a better defensive formation, but Morcar's more experienced troops tore into the smaller Vikings. Unfortunately for the Saxons, however, additional Viking reinforcements arrived, and the clash quickly slowed into a stalemate. And, of course, due to the reinforcements available to Haradra, the longer the battle stretched, the worse off it was for the Saxons. In the meantime, Haradra had gathered enough of his men to begin his push, and he began to rush Edwin's left flank with his more elite units. Edwin's smaller force, mainly made up of fords, shattered under the pressure, and he had to flee north to organize the defense of York. Some of Haradra's men attempted to rush after Edwin, but the boggy marshes which prevented Morcar from defending it also prevented Harold from effectively chasing it. The remainder of their force charged towards the center, where Morcar's right edge desperately tried to wield the shield wall to face their opponents. It wasn't enough, and the outflanked Saxon left was crushed, fleeing as well. Although the Battle of Fulford was a Viking victory, each side suffered under 1,000 casualties. The Saxons' ability as a fighting force was diminished greatly. Because of Fulford, almost no northern troops would be present at the much costlier battles of Stamford Bridge and Hastings, putting much more power in the hands of the north for the time after the battles. York quickly surrendered after receiving word it didn't want to be looted. Tostig didn't want to damage his own capital, and the Viking force moved south to Rickall to set up camp. But Haradra's luck had run out, and something big was about to happen. Harold had forced his way north at a staggering pace, from London to York in just a few short days, fast enough that the Viking troops were totally unprepared for his approach. Haradra had traveled to Stamford Bridge, east of York, to arrange a hostage transfer, and on the hot day allowed his men to travel without all their equipment and armor, leaving only a few thousand back to guard the ships. Harold continued up the road and ambushed the unprepared Norse soldiers on the 25th of September. It was a total surprise. You see, the defenders were spread out and disorganized. Some near the bridge, others on the far side in the village. Tostig and Hedra even thought they might be friendly forces. After all, Godwinson was in London. No way he could march that fast up to York. Harold had been incredibly lucky. The Vikings were tired, disorganized, not at full strength, and had been taken by complete surprise. Harold, posing as his own herald, met Tostig, at the bridge. Harold promised Tostig the return of his earldom, plus additional land. However, Tostig did not want to be known as the man who had betrayed the men he had brought to England, and so quite honorably refused, the three men riding off. A small Viking vanguard managed to hold the bridge against the Saxon forces long enough for Haradra to reorganize his men and send for the troops he had left to defend the fleet at Rickhall. After the vanguard fell, one lone Viking reportedly continued to hold the bridge, killing perhaps 40 men in the process. Allegedly, a Saxon had to float up the river and barrel and poke him in the balls through the bridge slats just to kill him. Haradra drew up a shield wall on a small hill east of the bridge, and Harold sent the few cavalry units he had in a probing attack against the tough Viking shield wall. The wall held, and Harold's cavalry retreated. Sensing blood, Haradra made the fateful decision to order a charge, disrupting the orderly Viking line, straight into the Saxon shield wall. The fighting was bloody and fierce, especially in the center, but the Saxon cavalry regrouped and swung around the Norse left flank, shattering it. At the same time, Haradra was killed in the center by a stray arrow. This left what was left of his men fleeing, shattered and disorganized. Tostig attempted to redraw his men and hold the line, but refused to surrender to Harold's messengers, and so the strong Saxon force charged the weakened and ill-prepared Viking shield wall and managed to easily destroy it. Tostig was killed in the fighting. The reinforcements under Harold's son-in-law, Eystein Orr, arrived south of the town, but the 3,000 ill-prepared men, enraged at the defeat of their comrades, tried to charge the much larger Saxon shield wall. They were crushed. Finally, Harold marched south to Rickhall and encountered the few remaining Vikings under Edward's son, Olaf. Harold allowed them to sail back to Norway after obtaining oaths that they would never return. So ended the Viking Age, and with it, the age of Scandinavian descendants. Never again would a great Viking fleet threaten the shores of England or any other continental power. So totally had Harold defeated the last Viking army that only 24 of the 300 ships Haradra had marched forth with were required to sail the remaining men back. However, the battle had been costly for the Saxons too. Maybe 5,000 men, or a third of their force, was killed. They had lost much of their cavalry, meaning that Harold's army was reduced to mainly spearmen and axemen. Compared to 1,000 Northmen killed at Fulford, Stamford Bridge was won at a truly immense toll. Harold had defeated the Vikings, but his luck was about to turn just as Haradra's had done. The wind switched direction just as he was smiking Viking ass out north, and William was able to start sailing. Edward and Morcar refused to join Harold. no northern men would be at Hastings. And third, lastly, his cruisers, who had been assigned to patrol the coast, had run out of provisions and returned to resupply, just as William crossed. William successfully marched over, landed at Penevesay Bay, seized the city of Hastings, which had 1,000 men, but surrendered without a fight, built a castle, and started raiding the lands of Kent and Sussex. With his castle built, he was then able to continue receiving reinforcements and strengthen his position. Harold returned south after receiving word from his brother Leofwine of the landings, and sailed north at London for a week or so, as his army was exhausted and weakened from the losses up north and the forced marches. But he was king. It was a pretty bad look to have your enemy running around burning all your peasants, so he was eventually convinced to march into battle. Harold's army was still badly weakened and deeply tired, so the short stay in London hadn't provided him enough time to gather a significant army, or even reach the number he had started with. His brother Gurth offered to invade William himself, wisely counseling Harold to stay back at London, as the death of the king would mean the end of the war, at least for the House of Godwinson. Harold, however, refused, and set off with his army towards Hastings. On October 12th, the Anglo-Saxons arrived at Culbeck Hill, northwest of Hastings, and set up camp for the night. William's scouts detected the force and ordered his men to retreat to the keep. Worried that an ambush would occur. By the next morning, neither side had attacked, and William marched his forces up to Tellermill. Harold marched closer to Senlac Hill to ensure that William would be unable to outflank him to the nearby force. The battle was ready to begin. Harold had around 8,000 men compared to William's 7,500. William's men were more experienced and less tired, but Harold's men were defending their home. Altogether, the two sides were about equally matched. Harold had 7,000 Furs and another 1,000 Huscarls. Nearly all were basic infantry armed with axes, spears, and shields. The Huscarls were mainly concentrated in the center, but Harold spread his Thanes and his two brothers and their Huscarl bodyguards along their flank to shore up the Furs. Harold commanded the center, Gurth on the Saxon right, and Leofwine was on the Saxon left. William's armor had a much weaker infantry contingent, only 4,000 of them, but they were generally much more experienced. He also had 2,000 heavy cavalry and 1,500 archers. William himself commanded the center with his largest force, the Normans. They also had most of the heavy cavalry. The left was commanded by Alan Rufus, leading mainly Bretons, and the right was the smallest, with the Flemish, the Picardians, and the remaining French commanded by Count Eustace. William set his archers up to skirmish with the Anglo-Saxon shield wall. The arrows simply bounced off the tough shields of the defenders. Their targets remained quite unharmed. A frustrated William then ordered the attack, sending his heavy infantry forward. The infantry were pelted by javelin fire, and so when they finally managed to engage on the tall hill, they had a disadvantage. They had fewer men, the low ground, and were fighting against an organized shield wall. For 30 grueling minutes, the two sides meleeed, but finally, the Saxons' many advantages tipped the balance in their favor. With William's ranged and infantry assaults exhausted, he was left with only one option to win a swift victory: cavalry. He sent his 2,000 heavy knights forward, but as any Total War commander knows, you should never charge your cavalry straight uphill, especially into a solid line of enemy spears. By the time they reached the top, the charge had been dented and slowed, and the knights were reduced to simply more mounted infantry thrown into the meat grinder. William's assault had failed. It seemed that the Saxons were designed to take the day, and to fulfill prophecy, it was at this moment the Norman left finally broke, the remnants fleeing desperately. Unable to keep up the assault with an exposed flank, William was forced to bring the entire army back. But from the jaws of defeat, victory was seemingly snatched. As the fleeing Bretons ran to terror, the disorganized and undisciplined Furs opposite of them began a massive charge, rushing down the hill to slaughter many of the Brittonic troops. They exposed their flanks in the process, in an attempt to support their outnumbered and out-of-position Fords, Gurth and Leofline both charged forward, engaging the main Norman line. Altogether, it had seemed that the Normans had drawn the Saxons out. Now, you see, it nearly worked. A rumor that William had been killed spread throughout the demoralized and beleaguered Norman line. William did not hesitate a moment, pulling his helmet off, making himself vulnerable to enemy attack, and rode throughout his army, reassuring his men he was still alive. With new vigor instilled into them, the Normans held the line. Out of formation, this time it was the Saxons who were outnumbered and repelled. Both of Harold's brothers were slaughtered. Their foolish attack quickly repelled. Odo of Bayeux performed a similar feat on the Breton left. He urged them back forward into the fray, and the wildly running Fords were suddenly stopped by a heavy iron anvil. William wheeled his reserve cavalry around to the left, the hammer swinging down. He hammered and anviled them perfectly. The disorganized Fords were trampled under roaring Norman hooves and disintegrated beneath their cold iron lances. Alone the fighting started. Each side had been around equally weakened. But William knew Harold only needed to keep the hill and keep William out of England. And because William was the invader, he was the one who needed the decisive victory here now. More importantly, the fighting had taken the heaviest toll on not the Saxon Fords, but rather their elite thanes and huscarls. Harold was near the breaking point. Only a few more blows would bring him to it. William decided to copy the skillful tactic that had weakened the Saxon right earlier that day. He ordered his entire army forward, infantry and cavalry together, throwing everything he had left against the enemy. After a few minutes, the Bretons, on command, retreated again. But this time, it was a feint, and his cavalry reeled around to outflank and destroy the enemy giving chase. They, of course, repeated this tactic again and again. By the end of it, and as the battle wore on, Harold was forced to continue diverting his valuable reserves to his right flank. Reinforcements that were desperately needed in the center and left. Additionally, these reinforcements were generally weaker Fords. The huscarls and thanes on the front lines having been heavily damaged. The Saxons were finally at that crucial breaking point William had needed. William ordered his remaining infantry and archers forward. And this time, his initial strategy seemed to work. Firing over their own troops, the arrows heavily damaged the Saxon line this time. The Fords having less armor and shielding needed to protect themselves from missile fire, and the cavalry were able to begin providing the tough charge he had needed. He and his knights punched through the Saxon center, where an arrow pierced Harold in the eye. Then Eustace and some of his comrades pushed through from the right and struck down the wounded king. Most of the huscarls, thanes, and all three of their leaders dead, the demoralized Fords fled the field. The last members of Harold's bodyguard were outflanked and crushed, surrounded, and at their wits' end. The battle, it appeared, had been won. Following some simple chase tactics, William appeared victorious. There you go. That was it. The end of the Norman Conquest of England. Thank you guys for watching. Enjoy it. No. I'm kidding. The Norman Conquest was not one measly battle. It was a series of campaigns, sieges, clashes, raids, and wars that lasted over the course of many years. It was also an exchange of cultures, of peoples, of language, and of ideas. One battle does not bring that kind of change, no matter how influential it may be. You see, William just stuck around in his keep for a while, waiting for the remaining rulers to crown him king. They didn't. Instead, you see, Stigand Ealdred, Archbishop of York, Earl Morcar, Edwin, and Waltheof, and many other prominent nobles, including Exeter, the Sheriff of Middlesex, and a reeve of London, gathered in the nation's capital. Morcar and Edwin attempted to have one of their own the crown, the new ruler, but were forced to compromise on Edgar Atheling following resistance from the clergy. Must be kind of awkward to be passed over and then picked only when the last guy died. William seemed to think like the majority of people. After all, he had just killed the king and both of his brothers. Wasn't he king by default? William waited in Hastings for a few days to gather reinforcements and replenish his army, then began subjugating the earldom of Kent. He burned the town of Romney, and the great fortress of Dover surrendered without a fight. Continued north to Canterbury, seat of the English primate, which also fell bloodlessly. Kent had followed quite quickly, with no or nearly no effort. William continued north toward London and arrived at Southwark, on the bank of the bridge into the city. Issachar formed a large force to repel him. Issachar had also been Harold's banner-bearer. And the old Harcathanute from way back had died at his alcohol poisoning at Issachar's grandfather's wedding reception. Issachar had been wounded at Hastings, so he had to command from a stretcher. Around 500 Norman knights defeated a small force of London militia, but were unable to hold the bridge from local resistance. Instead, they burned the town and fled, the river being too large to successfully ford. His advance on London repelled, William split his forces into two. One group began taking Wessex and secured the surrender of Winchester from the widowed Queen Edith. The Edith who was Confessor's wife, I know it's confusing, not the Edith who was Harold's first wife or the Edith who was Harold's second wife. William himself marched around the city to the west, but was continuously blocked in the crossing of the Thames until he reached Wallingford. Here fell the last chance of an English king defeating William. Perhaps the combined forces of the north and the remnants of the south could have driven William from the island. Morcar and Edwin, with William's army encircling them, abandoned their newly elected king, fleeing north. Perhaps they thought William would be content with simply taking Harold's old lands, or disgruntled at the passing over during the election. Stigand then surrendered to William, sensing that Edgar's new government was about to collapse as fast as Anthony Eden's after the Suez Crisis. William then continued his process of sacking and subjugating throughout Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, and Herefordshire, nearly cutting off the city of all escape routes. At Berkhamsted, the city surrendered, mainly led by the few leaders still left in London, Edgar, Ealdred, and Issachar. I mean, they really love the letter E, don't they? William had finally won the day. The Norman Conquest was, in fact, over. William's going to be crowned king in Westminster in the middle of London, with all the nobles swearing fealty to him forever and ever. They're never going to rebel, and it's just going to be so awesome. And no, I'm kidding again. In any case, on Christmas Day, he finally did receive his coronation. Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, would usually carry out the ceremony. He was a fine specimen of a human being, however. He was in the quarrel of the Pope with a variety of reasons, so Ealdred had been the one who had crowned William, just as he did for Harold. Stigand was excommunicated, held multiple sees, and collected the revenue from all of them, and his office had been taken when the other archbishop was still alive. All very, very naughty things for an archbishop to be doing. Ealdred, in the meantime, was basically the only Anglo-Saxon nobleman in the entirety of England who would stay loyal to William throughout his entire reign. William was proclaimed the king. All the peasants started cheering in support, but the Norman guards, who didn't speak a whiff of English of the peasants, were booing William and burned half the city down. Yeah, I bet that was an awkward conversation. So at this point, William was the king of England. Combined support of Ealdred and Stigand and papal approval, although only given after the invasion had taken place, gave perhaps the most valuable ally of the Norman conquest, the clergy, and through it, the Anglo-Saxon administration. Anglo-Saxon administration was far more advanced than you'd expect for the early Middle Ages. A thing called the writ recorded any land grants made between nobles, and this writ meant the king had a list of almost all the land anybody had ever traded or inherited. so taxing was very easy. There was already a semi-organized feudal system. Each thane owned at least 5 hides of land and had to send a fighting soldier for the army. Shires were organized and run by reeves. Bishoprics and archbishoprics were common throughout England, and the majority of its population were Catholic. And earls were elected by the king. The clergy were run in exactly the same way as in Normandy, and the Norman knights and counts could simply be swapped for the thanes and earls. William's first act was to force all the nobles to give him all their land, and took it from those who were dead or who he disliked. He needed to satiate the soldiers who had marched with him in exchange for promises of riches and land to keep his grip on power. He robbed dead men regardless if any of them had sons, brothers, or widows. Yeah, as you can imagine, this pissed a lot of people off. The ease in which he fully integrated the South comes from a few main factors, the most prominent of which was, of course, the Battle of Hastings. Nearly the entire South is under possession of the powerful Godwinson family, Harold, Gurth, and Leofine. Combined with the thanes who died at Hastings and the subsequent repossession of their land, William came into the fight with most of his troublesome opposition already lying dead. Many of the manors controlled by these dead Saxons were given out freely to those in William's army. A Breton freeman could suddenly jump to a knight and a lord. Many heiresses were widowed, and William married them to his nobles who sent their children to monasteries. The Saxons had been a ruling class, not necessarily the entire population, and William quickly and ruthlessly worked to replace them with his French allies. Remember, many Normans already had powerful positions from the days of Edward the Confessor, especially in the church, and the Britons of Brittany were initially Britons. By the time of the conquest, nearly all the southern low nobility had been replaced with his supporters. The people of the South were accustomed to constant invasion. They simply saw this as similar to another Viking coup. Remember, the Saxons were invaders themselves. Many of the people were older Bretons, or Vikings who were disdainful as Harold as they were of William. The average life of a peasant during the conquest, at least in the South, was relatively peaceful. William was also incredibly close to England. On a clear day, you can see the English coastline from the Norman one. It took only several hours to cross in a favorable wind. It was relatively easy to crush any rebellion going on in the south. They sprang up while you were vacationing in Rouen. And most famously, of course, William built castles. He built many castles. It took only a couple weeks to construct a motte and bailey, and they were able to absolutely dominate the countryside, preventing any form of meaningful local resistance save for only the most centralized. With no nobility or warriors left in the south, William crowned king with an army close enough to wreck revolts, new Norman lords loyal to William, a structured royal administration system that was sustained throughout the war, the support of the clergy, a docile populace, and of course the ever-present castles, William was able to seize relatively easy control of the south. Then William left. Just like that, in 1067, he left the frickin' country. He had been king for under 3 months, and he left. Castles were still being built. New lords were still being introduced to their land, and William's presence wasn't even felt remotely north of Hereford. His armies hadn't even touched the Mercian or Northumbrian lands. He was king there, only in name, and even that was tenuous. He was simply the only real claimant left. As for who he left in charge, and to those he gave more lucrative titles, since there was no upper nobility, he divvied up his earldoms between the powerful lords he needed to besiege. The estates were mostly split between many different nobles, to ensure no one lord could have enough power to rival the old Earl Godwin. Most of the land was given to the Norman counts who had their manors in the 2 different continents, such as his brother Otto, Bishop of Bayeux, and close friends William Fitzosborne, Lord of Bretewell. Local landowners who supported him were also given land grants, such as the new Earl of East Anglia, an Anglo-Saxon named Ralph. This helped make sure they were unable to mount any effective resistance, as their unconsolidated land was severely weakened. If they launched a rebellion in England, William could take half their land in Normandy. With the exception of Odo, who was given Dover Castle and the vast majority of Kent, they were nearly split up even more throughout the south and Normandy, so as to avoid any of them from becoming too powerful, even split into multiple groups. Otto was made Earl of Kent and regent of the general area east of England, and William Fitzosborne was made Earl of Hereford, and given responsibility for the west of England, including Winchester, as well as the marches under their control. He was also given at least nominal authority over the north. William thought he could conveniently ignore the fact that he had neglected the north of the country by taking their high nobility captive. Seward, Waltheof, Edwin, Edgar, and Morcar were all taken by William back to Normandy, where they'd remain for the next few years. He had underestimated the northern people's tendencies to overthrow and murder rulers they didn't like. The northern clergy he had a slightly lesser grip on than the south, specifically the Bishop of Durham, Ethelwine. The northern lords were still alive, still of their lands, and although the captivity of them had delayed any northern rebellions for a few years, it didn't fix the cause, just negated the effects. The northern losses, specifically their nobility, were a fractional of the southern losses, maybe under a tenth. Harold had lost around 8 to 10,000, Hastings and Stamford combined. Whereas the northern troops had lost under 1,000 Fulford. And because of that battle, they weren't present at any of the more costly battles. The north is far further from Normandy than the southern coast is. A day from Caen to Dover is an extra week or two from Dover to Durham. There were no castles being constructed in the north. And then, of course, William stayed in Normandy for 9 months, which had been regencyed by his wife during his absence. There were very few things that had happened back there, save the Archbishop of Rouen dying. It would have been far more prudent to remain in his newly conquered kingdom. Suffice it to say, the situation in England was a bit of a mess. The two regents were pretty awful specimens of human beings. If aliens showed up and found them, they'd probably just destroy the earth to make way for, a highway route. Say they'd be doing the people a favor. They were greedy, ambitious, and ruled like tyrants. They oversaw the necessary business of forcibly instating the king's two Norman appointees, and allowed their men to rape and sack freely. They raised taxes from the people just to ship them off to William in Normandy, essentially stealing their wealth. This continued to piss the people off. So William wasn't too keen on the fact that he had a few powerful earls holding over half the land of his kingdom, and once they were safely his captives in Normandy, began stripping them of lands. Edwin's most important and lucrative pieces, the Welsh marches of Shropshire and Chester, were seized by William, and an even worse toll was extracted from Morcar. Morcar's earldom was split into two, with the bulk of the land created into a brand new earldom of Bernicia, also known as Northumberland, and occasionally Northumbria, which can get confusing when you have two earldoms. However, the land he had revoked was only titular his. His power didn't stretch beyond basically where his army had marched, so only the southeast was under his control. And then the first rebellion struck. Edward the Wild, Lord of Shropshire, did not like how Fitzosborne was trying to take his land, and hated the invaders with a special passion. Allying with two Welsh warlords, he revolted, burned much of Hereford, and then fled like the wind. His conquest was already off to a worrying start. Peasants in Kent also rebelled, and invited Count Eustace over the Channel to help overthrow Otto. They were disorganized and easily routed by Otto while trying to take Dover. Much of Eustace's land was seized. Trying to repeat what he had done in East Anglia, William chose Copsey as the first new Earl of Bernicia. He had been an ally of Tostig, and was present at Stamford Bridge, but has survived and quickly paid homage to William upon William's victory. William thought that appointing him the new Earl would be smart. Boy, was he wrong. Copsey had been one of the cruel administrators deposed during the revolt against Tostig only 2 years previously. Copsey's rival was a local magnate named Ossoff, whose father had been the Earl of Bernicia a long time back, and Copsey's rule lasted a measly 3 weeks before he was murdered and replaced. Ossoff lasted a shockingly long 6 months before he too was killed by bandits. Will then essentially sold the title of Bernicia to another northern native named Gospatrick. That's our 5th Earl up north in only 2 years. Let's keep track of that. William finally returned to England to deal with the ongoing confusion. Recognizing the chaos that had been wreaked in his absence, he began working to instate his authority in the lands outside of his control. His first move was west. In 1068, the city of Exeter, at the urging of Githa, Harold's mother, rebelled. She fought with her grandsons, who were Harold's children. They were joined by many other towns in Cornwall, Devon, Dorset, and Somerset. William swiftly responded, marching through the lands, harrying and capturing cities as he went. Many of them surrendered. William arrived at Exeter and captured it in only 18 days. Githa and her grandchildren escaped west to Ireland. But by the end of the campaign, William had successfully subjugated the west. Many of the Cornish lands were granted to William's half-brother Robert, the next Earl of Cornwall. William at this point had control over most of Godwin's old lands, and he considered the south safe enough to have his wife crowned queen in England. The 3 sons of Harold, however, returned with Irish pirates and plundered the coast, but were beaten back at Bristol and in Dorset by one of Alan Rufus's brothers, named Brian of Brittany. He was one of William's most powerful Cornish magnates, and had for a time also been the Earl of Cornwall. The Irish raiders had been repelled, but the north erupted into flames. Edwin, Morcar, and Edgar all fled court, and joining up with the traitorous Gospatrick, went in rebellion. I mean, are you really going to trust the guy who literally bought the title from you? Like, that was definitely a big oversight on William's part. The reason for their revolt varied. However, it was primarily related to protest against the king and his regent's tyrannical policies. They were furious at the seizure of much of their land. Most of the northern people rose in rebellion with them, far preferring a king such as Edgar than a cruel foreign invader. William rose another army in response and began his long march north. However, the northern rebellion collapsed before it even began, with Edwin and Morcar following their usual tendency of abandoning their leader whenever anybody showed up with a certain number of men. Gospatrick and Edgar fled to Scotland, and William spent the rest of the year marching north, building castles and taking cities. Warwick, Nottingham, Leicester, even New York were all occupied. He then returned back south, thinking the north controlled. William replaced Gospatrick with a Norman named Robert de Comines. Bernicia was getting more earls than the Italians get prime ministers. This must be fun. He sent Robert north with 700 men to keep his new earldom subdued. Can you guess what's going to happen next? Let's take a peek. With York under his control following William's previous campaigning, he continued with his army to take Durham, where he was met by Athelwine. Athelwine warned him not to enter Durham, which Robert ignored. He then let his soldiers loot the city. Real smooth there, buddy. He was predictably killed. Gospatrick and Edgar returned to Bernicia and formed an army with Athelwine. They entered York, were welcomed by the citizens, and besieged the castle. William goes, "Come on, man. What the fuck?" Marches north with another army, drives them away, builds another. Then they revolted again. William goes, "What the fuck?" And Fitzosborne is barely able to fight them off. This is getting annoying. autumn 1069, and another revolt erupts, this time to the west. Edric attacks again. Harold's sons raid again, and the cities of Cornwall rebel. Again. Bruh. This is getting really annoying. King Sweyn of Denmark, probably trying to imitate his more famous ancestors, sends a fleet to aid the Anglo-Saxons. They tried to land up the eastern coast, but failed and instead went to York. Yeah, William is pretty annoyed. Patrick and Edgar show up with another army from Scotland. Waltheof joins the rebels, and they all link up with the great Viking fleet. Ealdred, the archbishop, probably the only noble who hasn't rebelled against William at this point, decides it's the perfect point to die, and so he does. The remaining Norman commanders burned the city and fled, and York was lost. William goes, what the fuck? However, the northern army dispersed soon after due to disorganization, infighting between the Danish nobles, and poor leadership by Edgar. Unfortunately, at the same time, with reports of the Saxon success at York exaggerated, more revolts happened in the west, this time in Shropshire and Herefordshire. William goes, what the fuck? Marches north in another army, drives them away. Alright, hang on. Hold up, just a moment. I think I'm starting to see a pattern here. William's been the crowned king for over 3 years at this point, and it seems every year another part of the kingdom raises its arms in revolt, always around Edgar speeding down from the north. William sees the pattern too, and he's getting pissed. He needs to make an example out of the north, to show the kingdom what happens if they revolt against him. And so we get to one of the worst events in English history. The harrowing of the north. He crushed the Mercians near Stafford, drove away the Danes in Lincoln, recaptures York, takes Waltheof and Patrick captive. He decides to restore their earldoms, although this may or may not have been the best choice, and marries Waltheof to his niece. William then incinerated everything he could see. He slaughtered animals, burned forests, poisoned rivers, destroyed fields, flamed stores, plundered churches, and demolished villages. Everything in his sight was laid waste, looted, destroyed, and wrecked, leaving nothing but burning hulks in his wake. He continued this process in Durham and Bernicia, burning and looting. Finally, he wintered in York, taking control of the city for the final time. Records of the Doomsday Book show that 75% of the population was killed or displaced, and it would remain politically and economically irrelevant for hundreds of years to come. The North wasn't necessarily conquered per se, rather it was destroyed. William no longer needed to conquer it, as there wasn't much left to conquer. The spirit of the few Saxons that remained had been broken. The harrowing the North wasn't the end of the conquest, however. First off, Chester needed to be finished off, and William was compelled to march there in February 1070. William also began replacing the clergy with loyal foreigners. Ealdred was succeeded by a Norman named Thomas, and the disloyal Stigand was deposed and replaced by an Italian named Lanfric. This process was continued throughout William's reign, and by the end only one bishop, St. Wulfstan of Worcester, was a proper Englishman. The Danish fleet never went away. Instead, they sailed to East Anglia and in May landed at the island of Ely. They were welcomed by the people and were joined by a Saxon noble named Hereward. They looted the monastery of Peterborough, but the Danish fleet soon sailed home due to arguments. William continued south, and finally captured Edric the Wild, marking the end of the rebellion in the west, with Hereward's pocket still stood. Edwin and Morcar escaped court again to join the rebels, but Edwin was betrayed by his companions and slain by the Normans. Morcar and Hereward fought bravely for nigh on a year, but were finally surrounded, betrayed, and captured. Hereward was killed, and Morcar was imprisoned for the rest of his life. stripped of his titles, never to revolt again. That was the end of the local resistance, but William would still face threats from his new Norman vassals. William's first order of business was breaking up Mercia. He didn't want anyone to have the power that Edwin previously had. The wealthiest part of Mercia, the marches of Shropshire and Chester, were broken into two and given to Roger Montgomery and Hugh of Ratches. To defend against the Welsh threat, William gave these earls special powers. They could build as many castles as they wanted and had their own courts, their own laws. In exchange for their increased protection, however, they grew more powerful, and the Marcher earldoms would eventually become the most valuable fiefdoms in the entire kingdom. The rest of Mercia was split between the de Beaumont brothers. The elder brother Robert, Count of Milan, was created the Earl of Leicester, and the younger brother Henry was later made Earl of Warwick. Areas such as Lancashire and Yorkshire were much more heavily divided. Local lords from ruling families like Roger the Poitevin, third son of Roger of Shrewsbury, or Alan Rufus, were all given wardships. The Welsh were a warring and fractured people, and so the Marcher lords were able to keep them in check, but the Scots were much stronger and centralized under a strong ruler. King Malcolm had also married Edgar Atheling's sister, and he had sheltered enemies of William time and time again. William set out on an expedition with a larger army in 1072. Malcolm, however, recognizing the futility of standing up to such an overwhelming force, surrendered and paid fealty to William. Just as the King of England, being a vassal of the French king, would cause much future conflict to come, so would the King of the Scots, being a vassal to the English king, cause war on the northern border. The new king was worried that Gossip Patrick would betray him, and so he revoked his lands. But he needed somebody he could trust, somebody loyal to him and accepted by the people by the north. If only there was somebody who could foot the bill. Wait a minute. Waltheof, William's nephew-in-law, was made Earl of Northumbria and sent north to rule it. Although Seward had died in 1055, nearly 2 decades prior, of the 7 or so men who had ruled over the land during the interim, every single one had been either murdered, deposed, or slain in battle. Seward's son had finally inherited what was rightfully his. The next few years were spent by William dealing with his Norman possessions. He fought in Maine, the Vexin, and Paris, against many allies, such as the King of France, Count of Flanders, and even his own son. Ingvar tried sailing to France to ally with the king, but was shipwrecked and brought to William's court, where he was held in house arrest for the rest of his life. There was one last revolt in William's reign, but it wasn't a revolt by any disgruntled Saxon nobleman. In fact, most Saxons chose to side with William during the war. Roger, Earl of Hereford, the son of William's old friend, also named William, tried to arrange a marriage between his sister Emma and Ralph, Earl of Norfolk. Ralph was the son of the older Ralph, and these men made up the second generation of Norman rulers. William banned the marriage, but the two went through it anyway. Waltheof also joined them, and the 3 men raised their flags in rebellion. However, almost exactly as nearly every other rebellion collapsed, one of the Saxon lords betrayed them, this time Waltheof, and it quickly began to fall apart. The 2 other earls tried to link up near London, but Bishop Wulfstan cut Roger off at Worcester. Odo arrived with another army in Cambridge and pushed Ralph back. Ralph left Emma to defend Norwich and fled to Denmark, where he tried to gather another invasion force. He failed, and Emma was soon forced to surrender to William, and they fled to exile in Brittany. The Norman Conquest was finally over. This time, I mean it. People like to pretend that the Battle of Hastings was the beginning of the conquest, but in reality, Hastings was just one battle. It was subsequent years of campaigning, devastation, and sieges that really gave William control of his kingdom. He replaced nearly all the Saxon nobility with new Norman and French ones. The church was purged of Saxon bishops. Many thanes and landowners were also slaughtered. Most of the powerful new earls held lands both in Normandy and in England. The two territories would stay intertwined for the rest of the medieval period. Modern English culture came about because of conquest. English is a mix of Norman and Anglo-Saxon. Many modern words came from both dialects. Lost the Anglo-Saxon Earl Waltheof was beheaded for treason. William wasn't going to make the mistake of trusting him not to rebel again. The earldom of Northumbria was finally destroyed, and most of the land was given to local nobles. He had no sons, and so his daughter became an heiress, married off into Norman Scottish families, their line going extinct. The rest of William's life wasn't too happy. Most of his troubles would come from the continent, including a rebellion by his own son and constant wars with the Bretons, Angevins, and the French king. He even imprisoned his own brother, Otto. He did bring many new ideas to English administration, such as the reformation of the clergy, or the Domesday Book, which recorded every manor, sheep, and person in the country of England. But at the same time, much of it was simply borrowed from the already existing Anglo-Saxon infrastructure strong enough that William was able to spend most of his reign back in Normandy, as would many of his successors. William finally died on September 9, 1087, ironically enough from catching a cold while burning down a French town. His second son, William Rufus, succeeded him as King of England, and a series of wars and disputes between his siblings, children, and grandchildren would follow, not ending until the coronation of his great-grandson, Henry II, near 100 years after his. And the dual ownership of lands in France and England would pull England into continental politics and start a long-running rivalry between the two nations that wouldn't end until the First World War. That, my friends, is the Norman Conquest. Hey guys, if you've made it this far in the video, I just want to thank you so much for watching. It's been a lot of fun working on this. I hope you enjoyed it. I've hoped you've learned a lot of stuff from it. I just want to say I would really appreciate it if you took the time to like, subscribe, share with your friends. This took me over a month to make. At the time of this recording, I have 27 subscribers, so it would really mean a lot to me, and it would make sure that I keep on working on this channel, because obviously, if it doesn't gain any traction, I probably won't be doing that. There are better things I can be doing with my time, but if this video does well, I'll definitely be back for you guys with more content. So I just want to make sure to hit that big red button. And again, thank you guys for watching. See you later. Bye.